Hi girls, this is Miss Gaska. This is a continuation of Activity 4.5 of the 7th grade Springboard book. Preview. In this activity, you will read a poem and think about the way the author uses language. So setting a purpose for reading. This is the most important part to consider because it's telling us what we should do as we're reading. First of all, it wants us to underline words and phrases that create a mood. So what mood does it create? We're underlining words or phrases that give us the answer to that question. We're also going to be circling unknown words and phrases and trying to figure out what we think they mean. Finally, we're going to mark the text to indicate use of language that is new or appeals to you. So I'm going to read the entire poem with you, but I'm only going to show you how to annotate using the first stanza. So this is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. If you guys were with me since October, then this poem will be very familiar to you because we read it at that time. So let's get started. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this and nothing more." So, here's how I would annotate that. First of all, we're underlining things that create a mood. So, right away we have once upon a midnight dreary. So we're used to hearing once upon a time in like a fairy tale. So that phrase, once upon, sets us up to expect a fairy tale. But since it's once upon a midnight dreary, we're getting the idea that we're going to get the opposite of a fairy tale. And I might want to jot that down in my notes. Once upon, opposite of a fairy tale. So while I pondered, weak and weary. So he's telling us that he's weak and he's tired, which is what weary means. And it's a dreary midnight, so it's dark, it's stormy. It's basically like saying once upon, it was a dark and stormy night in a fancier type of way. Then he says, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. The word forgotten also kind of gives me kind of like a sad connotation. And then he nodded, nearly napping. Suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this nothing more. So the word muttered kind of suggests to me that he's annoyed or aggravated in some way. So an additional thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at words that are unusual that I may not have heard or that I may not know the definition of. So I'm going to say quaint is a word that you guys might not be familiar with. I'm also thinking curious. You know what curious means in general, but in this sense, it means something different. Here it means strange, like a strange volume of forgotten lore. Speaking of lore, not quite sure you know what that means either, so I'm going to go ahead and circle it. I'm also going to want to point out to you guys the highlight pattern, or the rhyme pattern here. We have the word dreary, which rhymes with weary, which this is in the middle of the line, not at the end. So what this is called is internal rhyme. When it rhymes in the middle and then again at the end, that's internal. And then we're seeing a different rhyme pattern with lore, because it's rhyming here with door, which is used twice, and then again at the end with more. And then finally, we see another example of internal rhyme with napping here, also with tapping. And then we have the repetition of the word rapping, and again repeating the word tapping. So we're having some crazy rhymes going on here. I'm going to leave these ones in this teal color, but I'm going to change the colors of the rest of these just so that you can, visualize where the rhyme scheme is happening in this stanza. So I made the ones that rhyme with lore in yellow, and then I'm going to make the napping ones be green. Okay, so that's the rhyme scheme right there. And then finally, last but not least, I'm going to summarize for you what happens in each of these stanzas, because some of the language I know is a little bit complicated. So in this one, it was a dark and stormy night, and a weak and tired man is falling asleep when he suddenly hears a tapping at the door. He thinks it must be a visitor. Alright, So I'm going to continue telling you what each stanza means but I'm not going to show you the annotations. I'm going to leave that up to you. Please continue to find the rhymes, continue to find the unknown words that are unfamiliar to you, and continue to find the words or phrases that suggest the mood of the poem, which so far we have kind of like a dark, sad mood because of midnight dreary, weak and weary, things like that. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. So here he's talking about how it's December, the fire is going out, and he's wishing that it were tomorrow. It says, eagerly I wish the morrow, which means like I wish that tomorrow would come already. I'm done with this day. I've had enough. And then he's trying to get over his sorrow for the lost Lenore. We don't know how he lost her. Maybe she dumped him. We don't know. So surcease means like ending something. So he's looking to end his sorrow by distracting himself with these books. So I'm going to go ahead and type that on the side. So what I wrote was, it's December and he wishes tomorrow would come already. He's trying to overcome his sorrow by distracting himself with books, but he can't stop thinking about Lenore. So as I continue, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, to some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more. So he's kind of starting to get a little bit freaked out. It says that the purple curtains rustling kind of scared him. They thrilled him and filled him with terror. And then he's saying, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating. So he's trying to reassure himself by repeating that it must be a visitor. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note of that on the side. So what I wrote was, he is frightened by the atmosphere and he is trying to calm himself by reassuring himself that the noise was just a visitor trying to come in. Let us continue. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. So he says, hey, I think I heard somebody knocking, so I'm sorry that I didn't answer faster, and then he opens the door, but nobody is there. He's just talking to air. So I'm going to quickly write that note along the side. So what I wrote was, he gathers his courage and goes to see who's at his door, but when he opens it, no one's there. So now we have, deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. So he's looking into the darkness, and he is thinking about the possibilities, like, he's thinking about supernatural things, to be honest. He's dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. He's thinking that maybe it's the ghost of Lenore or the angel of Lenore come back to visit him. So that's why he says, out into the darkness, Lenore? Like, as in, Lenore, is that you visiting me? And then all he hears back is the echo. So he's feeling a little bit foolish. So what I wrote was that he stares into the darkness and considers that it might be some supernatural being visiting him, maybe even Lenore. When he says her name, all he hears in return is an echo. So I also wanted to point out that here is when we kind of get verified by his hinting Lenore has passed away. Otherwise, how could she be a ghost or an angel visiting him? So, let's continue. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. So now he goes back into his house, or room, and he hears a tapping again, a little bit louder this time, like more persistently even. And he says, okay, that's gotta be the wind knocking my lattice against the window. So let me open the window and see what there is so that I can finally solve this mystery. I'm gonna jot that down on the side. So what I said is he hears a knocking again and believes it must be the wind knocking his lattice against his window. He wants to calm down enough to solve the mystery of the tapping. So now, open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. So he goes to open the shutter on the window when a raven steps in. Now consider that the raven could be a symbol. Think about what ravens symbolize normally, these big black birds. Sometimes they're seen as bad omens. Sometimes they're seen as messengers of death. So consider how that has an impact on this kind of moody, spooky atmosphere that's already being created. So he goes and jumps onto a bust of Pallas. A bust is another word for a sculpture. And Pallas is another name for the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So he goes and sits on top of this statue of Athena that's right above the chamber door. Also, I forgot to mention that a bust is from the chest or the bust up to the top of the head. That's why it's called a bust. So I'm going to jot those notes down. So what I wrote here was that he opens the window and a raven steps inside, hopping over to sit on a bust of the goddess of wisdom, Athena. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So this raven has such a serious face that the guy kind of finds it a little bit funny. And so he's smiling at the bird and saying to the bird, like, oh, hey, visitor, what's your name? And he's surprised when the bird responds, saying nevermore. I also wanted to point out that where it says Plutonian, it's referring to the god of death, Pluto, also known as Hades in Greek mythology. So consider how that might play an impact on the poem as well. I'm going to jot down my note. So for my note, I put that the man is amused by the serious expression on the raven's face. He asks the raven what its name is, and he's surprised when it responds nevermore. Now, the next stanza says, much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast, upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door with such name as nevermore. So here he's saying, like, he's staring at the bird kind of shocked, and that, you know, nobody he could think of has ever been able to say that a bird came and sat in his room and talked with him. So what I wrote is that the man stares at the bird in shock, thinking that no one has ever experienced a bird speaking and calling itself nevermore. So as I continue, but the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said nevermore. So here he's saying that this bird only says that one word. And the man said to the bird, oh, you know what, I've seen other birds here before, other people here before, everybody leaves me, tomorrow he'll leave me just as everybody else has and just as my hopes have. And then the bird says nevermore, meaning I'm never going to leave. So I'm going to go ahead and jot down that note. So I put, the man says the bird will likely leave him just as all others have in the past, but the bird says nevermore, meaning never again will it leave. I also want to point out here that here we have an example of the man's depression, because he's reflecting on the fact that everybody leaves him. And what he's talking about here is most likely how Lenore has passed away and left him in this life, and that all the hopes that he had died with her. So next we have, startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken. Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom merciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of nevermore. So he's saying, okay, well, this must be the only word the bird knows. Like, he must have learned it from some unhappy master who just talked about nevermore, nevermore, and he's just repeating what he heard from his previous master. I'm going to go ahead and write that note. So what I said is that the man tells himself that the bird doesn't understand him, but it's just repeating the only word it knows, which it must have learned from some previous miserable owner. But the raven still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet seat, thinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. So the man is thinking, well, maybe it is a word he learned, but what if he really does mean it when he says nevermore? What could this be? Like, what's happening here? So the man is wondering about that. I'm going to jot a note. So what I put is that the man's still smiling at the raven and wondering what if in regards to whether the bird actually did understand his questions and what it would mean if he did. So, this I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lighting with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. So here, he's like looking at the bird and thinking about the bird, but then he's reclining on the cushioned chair that he's sitting on and realizes that Lenore will never sit on that chair again, and he falls back into his depression. I'm going to make a note. So what I wrote is that he sits upon his chair and thinks about the bird, but remembers that Lenore will never sit on that cushion again and gets upset again. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So, suddenly, he thinks that the air must have grown a bit thicker, and he suddenly smells a kind of perfume in the air. And he's saying that that God must have sent the raven to come and help him get over his sadness regarding Lenore. But then the raven says, nevermore, meaning, I wasn't sent by God, you're never going to get over this sadness. I'm going to go ahead and make the note. So here I said, the man suddenly smells a perfume and asks the raven if God sent it, and if he'd ever get over losing Lenore, but the bird says nevermore. I know this one's a little bit hard to read because of this note on the side, so bear with it. So the man continues saying, Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So he's saying to the bird, I don't care if you came from heaven or hell, or if you came from neither, just tell me, is there ever going to be something to soothe my wound, soothe my heart from this loss of Lenore? And the raven says no, basically, nevermore. I'm going to jot the note down. So for my note, I put, he says to the bird that whether it's sent from heaven or hell, he wants to know if there will be anything to heal him from the pain of Lenore, but the raven says nevermore. So to continue, Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn, if it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So the man is asking the raven, like, well, tell me, will I ever see Lenore again? Will I ever get to hold her, like maybe in heaven or something? And the raven says nevermore, meaning nope. So I'm going to jot my note down. So I wrote, he asks the raven if he will be able to reunite with Lenore in heaven, but the raven says nevermore. Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of thy lie, that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So he's saying to the bird, who pissed me off, basically, you need to leave, go away now. Get out of my house. And the raven says, no, I'm never going to leave you. I'm never going to leave you alone. I'm always going to be here to torture you. So I wrote that the man demands the bird leave after it's angered him with its answers, but the bird says nevermore, meaning it will never leave. Then the last part, and the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted, nevermore. So he's saying that the shadow of the raven is, his soul is just like that. Like, the shadow of the raven is always going to overshadow his soul. He's always going to have this depression, this grief over the loss of Lenore. And the raven is always going to be there to torture him and remind him of this pain that he's going through. So I'm going to jot down my note. So I put, the raven stays with the man forever to torture him and remind him of the loss of Lenore, and his soul will never lift, whether in happiness or to go to heaven. So, don't forget to annotate this poem, and then when you get down to these questions, this is how you answer them. So for number 1, it says, in the second stanza, how does the poet describe Lenore? What inference can you make about Lenore? So you need to go back to the second stanza, figure out what the poet says about her and what inference you can make about her. Number 2 says, what is the narrator's mood as conveyed in stanzas 1 through 6? No evidence to support your interpretation. So think about the mood, think about the words that the narrator uses to create the mood. Make sure that you use direct citations from the source and that you cite them. For number 3, it says, what context clues help you understand the likely meaning of the word entreating in stanza 3? So I recommend looking up this word first and then seeing what context clues kind of hint you toward that definition that you find. For number 4, when the raven first enters the room, what is the narrator's attitude toward it? Give evidence from the text. So look for when the raven first gets there and find out how the narrator feels about the raven at that point. For number 5, how does the narrator interpret nevermore the first time the raven says it? How can you tell? So what does the narrator think about that word the first time the raven says it? Number 6 says, reread lines 58 through 59. What does this suggest about the narrator's recent experiences? What inference can you make about the narrator's mood? So you're trying to find out what has happened to the narrator recently and how that can kind of give you an inference about the narrator's mood. For number 7, it says, highlight the adjectives in lines 19 through 54. Adjectives are words that describe a noun. So which ones are neutral and which ones have positive connotations and which ones have negative connotations? So that's like the association with the word, the feeling that goes along with the word. How do Poe's word choices add to the atmosphere and tone of the poem? Number 8 says, reread lines 85 through 86. In your own words, explain what the narrator is saying. Well, we've already kind of explained the whole poem, so go back and find those lines and find out what the narrator is saying with those two. For number 9, what words in the poem indicate that the narrator is becoming more and more upset or agitated? So you're going to be looking for the words that indicate that he's getting more and more angry about this bird. For number 10, how does the narrator interpret nevermore in line 95, and how is it different from the way he first interprets it? So compare the two ways that he interprets it there. And number 11, in 1 or 2 sentences, summarize the whole story of the raven. So just 1 or 2 sentences summarizing what happens. Number 12, what is the dominant image of this poem? How do the connotative associations with this image and other diction choices fit with the dark and eerie tone Poe is trying to create? So look for words that generate an image and find the one that stands out the most. What image is in your head for most of this poem? And how does that kind of go along with the tone that he's trying to create? And then you already know about end rhyme, the most common form of rhyme. In The Raven, Poe also makes use of internal rhyme. What examples of internal rhymes do you see in the first 2 stanzas? So luckily we already talked about that, so you can find that in the first poem that I already highlighted for you, and then find them in the second stanza. Number 14 says, how does the poem's structure or organization contribute to its meaning? Use evidence from the poem. So think about the theme of the poem, what it is that the author is trying to say, and then consider how structuring it in these stanzas, in the shape that they are, and the repetition, and things like that, and the refrains, how does this all contribute to the overall meaning that the author wants you to understand? And then 15 is, how does Poe use other poetic devices to develop the poem? Provide specific examples. That could be anything from the chart or any other poetic devices you might know. So then for Check Your Understanding, you need to read back through the poem and find one example each of metaphor, hyperbole, personification, and symbolism. Okay? Record each example in your reader-writer notebook. Well, you don't have a reader-writer notebook, so I want you to record over here in this notes section. Make sure to indicate the phrase from the poem that you're quoting, the line number, and what effect that language creates. So why did you choose that language? So based on your analysis of the poem, I want you to also write a paragraph that explains the purpose and effect of the raven. Be sure to use the summary you wrote, include your understanding of the central image, discuss 1 or 2 poetic devices Poe uses for effect, and use evidence from the poem. I also want you to cite your sources. So I hope that this was informative for you in regards to the raven. If you need any additional support, feel free to reach out and I will be glad to assist you with that. Thanks for watching and take care.